Good day. Well, today, after weeks of waiting for the Kherson counteroffensive to happen, and with no sign of the Kherson counteroffensive actually happening, we had announcements or informations from some Ukrainian officials that a counteroffensive in Kherson region is indeed underway. It's important to say that this counteroffensive doesn't seem to be aimed at recapturing Kherson city itself. Now, Boris Rozhin, who is a Russian commentator who publishes information, has an important blog which publishes under the name of Colonel Kassad, has provided us with what I suspect is the best detailed information as to what exactly is taking place. And he puts it like this. Ukrainian sources say a counterattack on Kherson, and he puts those words in quotation marks, and a strike in the direction of the village of Sukhoy Stavok near Belogorka, and even the capture of the village of Sukhoy Stavok. So far, there's an attempt to move from the Andrievka area in the direction of Bruskinskoye, Sukhoy Stavok, and Kostromka. In general, these are all the same attempts by the armed forces of Ukraine to implement the plans of mid-August with an attack on Berislav in order to cut off part of the bridgehead of the Russian armed forces on the right bank of the Dnieper. Intense artillery shelling of Berislav is recorded. The workshop of the machine building plant is on fire, as well as traditional positional battles on the Ingulets River, Krivoy Rog direction, and the Potemkino-Viskopolye region, Nikopol direction. Enemy losses in people and equipment. Of course, when he talks about enemy losses, he means Ukrainian losses in people and equipment are noted in the Olginka and Vizokopolye regions. Active battles are also going on in the area of Partizansky and Alexandrovka, where after the capture of Blagodatny, the front advanced towards Nikolaev. Now, I should say that these battles along in the area of Partizansky and Alexandrovka are battles which are the products of Russian attacks in the direction of Nikolaev. And then he goes on to say, this is again Boris Rozhin, in Novaya Kakhovka, the evacuation of residents to bomb shelters was announced due to many hours of shelling of the city from multiple launch rocket systems. Air defense works in Kherson and in the area of Kakhovka. It is worth noting that one HIMARS rocket did not work properly and fell intact on the territory of the region. It has already been taken out for study. And that is what Boris Rozhin says. And there's been a great deal more. This is from the Slavyangrad, which is another Russian website, and it reports it in this way. A small and belated breakdown, it means, I think, breakthrough, or a small and belated breakdown of the Ukrainian armed forces breakthrough in the Nikolaev-Krivoy Rog direction. For the last 3 days and 2 nights, the Ukrainian side has been particularly approachable in selecting targets for HIMARS strikes against Russian armed forces facilities in the Kherson region. Also, in the area of the Ingulets River, the work of any enemy reconnaissance units was repeatedly observed, including by forcing the Ingulets River by boat. This night, after further HIMARS strikes, the enemy attempted a breakthrough in several directions. Again, when this is a Russian site, so they're referring to the Ukrainians as the enemy. They engaged up to 3 crossing points, which they were unable to defeat. The advance of the enemy, the Ukrainians in other words, was also carried out with the support of a tank fist with a force of up to a company. That would be about 9 tanks. The work of the enemy aviation was noted, at least by helicopter. Of the successful attacks for the enemy, 3 ended. One of the successful ones was from the direction Andreevka-Lozovoye, as a result of which the Ukrainian army advanced by almost 6 kilometers and occupied the village of Sukhoy Stavok. An unsuccessful breakthrough attempt for the Ukrainian side turned out to be in the northeast direction in the settlements of Lubomivka, Mirolyubovka, Dobryavka, Olgino, Potemkino, and Vysokopolye. Here, paratroopers and troops from a Black Sea Brigade, in other words, Marines, undertook a success. These are Russian forces, undertook a counter-attack. But the enemy did not give up trying to encircle our forces in Vysokopolye without success. Our forces being Russian forces. According to tactics already worked out, it is possible to use territorial defense forces for assault tasks and volunteer forces for mopping up. On the whole, it is too early to talk about more precise advances and rollbacks. The situation is developing with variable success for each side. What can be said for certain is that the enemy has not approached the issue with all the confidence in its forces. The Ukrainians have managed to gain a foothold and create a bridgehead in one of the breached regions. The enemy is awaiting the approach of its forces. Their main maneuvers to withdraw their forces to their positions will probably be carried out with the onset of darkness. The Russians play from defense. There are expectations that the Ukrainian forces will strike as much as they can at the road infrastructure in the Kakhovka Dam. And then the Russians also report that 2 Sukhoi 25 jets were destroyed, and that 7 to 8 Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles were also destroyed, and that the Ukrainians have very high losses. Well, this is all the information that I'm getting from the Russians. The Ukrainians provide less information at the moment. Doesn't seem to me like a major advance. I suspect that this is partly connected with the Russian advances towards Nikolaev. The Russians have been advancing ever closer towards Nikolaev, and it looks to me as if the Ukrainians are trying and throw the Russians off balance by launching attacks, counterattacks on the flank of the Russian force as it moves towards Nikolaev. At least that's how it looks to me. Now, obviously, this is a developing situation, and if there's any further developments, I'm going to obviously cover them. But at least for the moment, this looks like a relatively contained affair. Certainly not the great counteroffensive that we were hearing about. And if Russian reports are to be believed, for the moment, it's having only marginal success. Of course, the Ukrainians say otherwise, but they've not been giving a huge amount of particularly detailed information. Now, what's going on elsewhere on the battlefronts? And the main fighting has been in Donbass. And interestingly enough, and before we got this information from Kherson region, the fog of war on the fighting in Donbass had actually lifted a little, and we were getting quite a lot of information about what was actually going on in Donbass. And the first thing to say is that it seems that 3 forces connected to the Russians are carrying out the attacks in Donbass. So the fighting in Bakhmut city itself and in this town, this neighboring settlement of Kodema, is being carried out by the Wagner organization, which is this strange mercenary outfit. Maybe not so strange. It does seem to bring together fairly well-trained, well-equipped Russian forces. Anyway, this force appears to be carrying out effective strikes in Kodema. Yesterday there were reports that the entirety of Kodema had been captured by the Russians, or at least by this Wagner force. It seems that they've captured most of Kodema, but not yet all of it, and there's still fighting going on there. But it's likely that before long they will capture Kodema, and that will bring them closer to the encirclement of Bakhmut city. And the Wagner unit is also located in Bakhmut city itself, occupying defenses on the Patrice-Lumumba highway. And the fighting there seems to be fairly static. These Wagner people, having advanced along this highway, have apparently taken steps to defend themselves there. They've positioned themselves there, and they're not advancing deeper into Bakhmut. They're waiting for their colleagues from the Wagner organization to clear Kodema and other places to the south of Bakhmut. And they're also waiting for the militia of the Lugansk People's Republic to clear Soledar. And here it's interesting because the fighting in Soledar, this northern suburb of Bakhmut, is apparently being carried out by a militia of the Lugansk People's Republic, even though Soledar is, of course, in Donetsk. So we see that the militias of the two republics are cooperating with each other. And alongside the fighting in Soledar, in Bakhmut city, and in Kodema, we received further reports that the militia, this time of the Donetsk People's Republic, is continuing its push through the fortified areas that the Ukrainians built up opposite Donetsk city. And it seems that the forces here, the militia here, is backed by massive artillery and missile barrages. It seems that all of these fortified places, these villages, Pesky, Marinka, Avdiivka, have been basically become depopulated over the years of fighting since 2014. And the attacks and the missile strikes, therefore, can take place on a relentless basis. And this is enabling the militia to destroy Ukrainian defenses in Avdiivka, in Marinka, and on the Donetsk ring road without having to engage in very heavy infantry fighting. And there's a report that something like 500 Ukrainian troops were killed in the fighting in Pesky, for example. Can't confirm this figure, but it's not implausible. And the Ukrainians have been throwing reinforcements into this area, but without much success, because of course what happens is that these reinforcements then get absorbed and badly battered by the artillery, the Russian artillery, which is supporting the militia as it carries out these advances. So the fighting apparently is extremely one-sided in this area, and I've heard some rather grisly stories that apparently the place, these fortifications, are now littered with the bodies of dead Ukrainian soldiers, and it's apparently impossible to collect them and to take them back for burial. And the result is that they are left covering the landscape in what I have to say, if it's true, would be a deeply distressing picture. Anyway, that's what's happening in Donbass. It looks as if the Russian allied forces are continuing their advances south of Bakhmut city, and they're gradually cracking up the defenses, the Ukrainian defenses opposite Donetsk city. So there's the greater mysteries about what's going on in Kherson, and as I've been making this program, there's been more reports that Ukrainian losses are actually extremely heavy in this counterattack in Kherson region, and that it's not actually making a great deal of progress. I can't confirm any of this, but we can see that there do seem to be major Russian advances going on in Donbass. Now, there's also reports, which I also cannot confirm, that a very large force is now accumulating in Rostov-on-Don. This is a city, a Russian city close to Donetsk, and it's referred to as the Third Corps of the Donetsk militia. And there's some reports that this force numbers something like 60,000 men. That's from the Russian side. Others put it lower at 40,000 men, and that it's all equipped with very modern equipment, with T-90 and T-80 tanks and BMP-3 armoured vehicles. And alternatively, there's British reports that the force numbers only 15,000 men, and that it's made up of poor quality volunteers and conscripts and people of that kind. But whatever it is, there's a lot of tantalizing discussion and debate about this force and what role, if any, it's going to have in the fighting. Now, I'm going to say this straight away. I don't know very much about this force. It's been conjured up out of nowhere. I'm not convinced that it's earmarked for the fighting that's underway at the moment. It seems to me that this force, if it exists, its existence is consistent with this pattern of what we hear from other places, from the area in Russia that adjoins Kharkiv region, and about this big build-up of helicopter forces and aerial forces, that what is happening is that the Russians are building up breakthrough forces for when the defense lines in Donbass are broken. And that's probably only a short time away, and that this is going to be the major, this is what these forces are for. They're being built up in preparation for what I suspect is going to be the major Russian offensive that the Russians are preparing. But, as I said, until we have a little bit more clarity about what this force is really all about, I'm not going to discuss it in much more detail. So, in the meantime, we've also had further reports about responses of people in the West, the governments and people in the West, to what is happening. We hear that there's going to be a meeting today of the European Union to discuss the energy crisis. It's completely unclear to me what the European authorities and the leaders of the various West European countries are going to do. Certainly in Britain, there doesn't seem to be any clear response to this energy crisis. Then we've also got reports that, despite the fact that Germany and France have apparently spoken out against this across-the-board visa ban on Russians travelling to Europe, that something rather like such a visa ban is going to be implemented after all. This is consistent with the story we've been hearing right through from the start of this conflict. Whenever Sanctions are proposed, even profoundly counterproductive sanctions. Various people speak out against them. Olaf Scholz opposed the action to cut off Russian banks from SWIFT. We've heard reports that others, including in the United States, opposed actions to interrupt or cut off Russian oil or gas supplies to Europe. And eventually, despite all of these assurances, protestations that such measures would not be made, sure enough, in the atmosphere of hysteria, in the atmosphere of anger that exists in the West, these counterproductive sanctions are eventually imposed. Now, it's not absolutely certain, as at the moment when I'm making this video, that these sanctions, this visa ban is going to be imposed, but I'm sorry to say it is looking increasingly likely. And to be clear about this, it's not only a mistake, one which will confirm further to Russians that Europeans don't want them, but of course it's also wrong. It's punishing ordinary Russians for things that they ultimately have only limited power over. And it's only going to antagonize people, and it flies completely in the face of the historic Western position, which was that the West was always open to people to visit it. It was the people like the Soviets who restricted movement of travelers, of tourists, of visitors. And now we see that it is the reverse. The Soviets have gone away. Russia has opened its doors, but the West now is responding by closing them. Meanwhile, there's more reports that officials from the International Atomic Energy Agency are going to visit the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. Perhaps in response to that, we're hearing that the Ukrainians have been increasing the shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power station in advance of that visit. We will see whether it even happens. But we're also seeing something which I find even more ominous. Now, I've spoken in the past of articles by Simon Tisdall, the foreign news editor of The Guardian. A short time ago, about 10 days ago, he had an article in which he was proposing that some kind of direct action be taken against President Putin himself. He didn't make it clear what it was, but I found the tone and content of his article extremely disturbing. Now, he has published another article. He talks about President Putin being desperate. I'm not quite sure why he thinks that President Putin is desperate. After all, as far as I can see, the situation economically within Russia is stable. Living standards may in fact be rising. Food prices and energy prices there are falling. There's no reason to think that anybody in Russia is going to be cold or hungry this winter, which isn't at all the position in the West. And his own support levels, according to the latest opinion polls in Russia, which I believe, by the way, put his support at 81%. And of course, in military terms, bar some unexpected result from this offensive in Kherson, things appear to be going his way. So I don't see why President Putin is desperate, but in Simon Tisdale's interpretation, things for Putin are getting desperate, and so he's going to work on his fifth column in Europe. He's going to work to undermine Western resolve, and he's going to work with all his allies in Europe, of which in Simon Tisdale's imagination there are lots of them, ranging from Viktor Orban in Hungary to Silvio Berlusconi and Matteo Salvini in Italy, to all sorts of influencers and opinion makers all across Europe. And one can almost see Simon Tisdale and people like him talking about a kind of enemy within. And I can't help but think that the agenda that's being followed here is that there's already an attempt being made to try to identify and discredit anybody who seeks some sort of negotiated end to this conflict as some sort of Putin enabler, some sort of Russian agent. Now that is, again, something totally different from what we used to do in the West. I can remember the Cold War. Lots of people during the Cold War who advocated engagement with the Russians, and they were always given, as I remember, a respectful hearing. Many people disagreed with them, but overall there was always a willingness to consider discussions, talks with the Russians. Well, not now. It looks like we're going to see a recrudescence of McCarthyism, though on a vastly worse scale, with anybody who suggests any form of negotiations, any form of resumptions of talks, any person who suggests that extreme measures like this visa ban are a bad idea, identified and criticized as an agent of Moscow. And I don't know how representative Simon Tisdall is in thinking like this, but I suspect he is very representative, and I suspect that over the next couple of days and weeks and months, as the situation in Europe gets harsher during the winter, as people find it increasingly difficult to pay their energy bills, as food prices continue to rise, as conditions become worse in Europe all the time, I suspect that we're going to see this attempt to squash any people who propose negotiations, anybody who talks about a slowdown or reversal of the economic war. I suspect we're going to see attempts to silence voices like that. I suspect we're going to see it intensify. And I can't emphasize and stress again how bad that is. I mean, putting aside that this is the fact that this is closing out options for negotiations, which we desperately need. Ukraine needs them. I mean, all those people whose bodies are apparently lying untended in places like Pesky and Avdiivka in the Donbass. I mean, this is terrible that this is happening to them, that their bodies aren't being collected. I don't even want to consider the feelings of their families. It's terrible for them. But of course, it's terrible for us in the West, though in a obviously less grim way as well. People are going to be experiencing enormous hardship, and yet they're going to be denied options. They're going to be told that however bad the situation is for you, you can't press forward with negotiations. So it's very bad in that respect. Of course, it's also very, very bad for the effect it's going to have on democratic societies in Europe, in the West. Because if there's going to be, as I'm afraid I very much fear, and as I said, I think that Simon Tisdall, I'm sure he's talking with complete sincerity. I'm not suggesting he's been prompted to say what he's saying, but I'm sure he's representative of a certain current of thinking in the West, and a powerful current of thinking at that, and one which has great influence in government. If what he wants happens, and we see attempts to intimidate and silence people, well, open discussion which is the essence of democracy. Without it, democracy can't function. It's going to be further threatened. But this is where we're heading. This is exactly the trajectory of travel, or so it seems to me, at least in Europe now. We are seeing European societies under enormous stress from rising food and energy costs and burgeoning inflation. And we are also seeing Western societies, at least in Europe, now possibly facing a concerted attack on their democratic systems. I've been worried about this ever since this conflict in Ukraine started. But it looks as if this is now going to intensify. And it seems to me that in Europe, this winter is going to be an extremely bleak one. Not just in terms of material hardships, but in terms of the effects on our political systems, an effect which might be irreparable. Well, that's all I'm going to say on this bleak day. We'll be getting more information, no doubt, about the Kherson counteroffensive, and no doubt we'll be finding out how much reality there really is to it. I'll be covering that, as well as the fighting in Donbass and elsewhere in Ukraine, and no doubt I'll be returning to the situation in Europe and eventually the United States. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find all my programs on various platforms, on Locals first and foremost, also on Rumble, on ODYSEE, and of course on Telegram. And I understand that we're also now looking at other platforms too. And also, please remember that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop, buying our goods, our amazing merchandise, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day. Until then.